All right, welcome to the last of the video series of the year where I just kind of shove all the information that we get a chance to cover in class on a flipped classroom and make myself look very enlightened and progressive and technological as a teacher. You're welcome. Okay, so chapter 36 is mostly about new patterns of nationalism or modern nationalism. Okay, so we're talking about countries that we've studied already that have been conquered by imperial powers and now are being freed and search for their own national identity. Now, we've seen this coming. Right? We've seen, even before we get to post-World War II, we've seen that the price of imperialism is outweighing the profits that you get from imperialism. It is a lot more expensive to take care of an empire than it is to get profits from an empire. And so the writing's on the wall here. And in fact, I would dare say even before World War II, the only thing keeping the European powers in the United States in the imperial game is status, right, is prestige. The fact that you have overseas holdings means that you are a very important country. And the conservatives in England and in France, namely Churchill and de Gaulle, are going to push this idea of how we need to keep our empire because it makes us look good. This becomes increasingly unpopular, though, and shortly after, as we'll see, World War II, many of these areas become independent. Now, this is not one of the stories, though, where the big bad bully Western country leaves and then the newly freed imperial country lives happily ever after. There is racial divide, ethnic divide in these countries that is going to prop up, and a lot of times we'll see examples of violence here. What we see here, and we can make a comparison here. Again, the AP is all about synthesis, but what we see is kind of a similar example as a Pax Romana or even a Mongol peace. And the imperial powers governing these areas have kept these problems quiet, right? You don't see a racial or ethnic conflict because the imperial power or the communist power, if it would come in and crush whatever conflict there was because it disrupts business and peace in the area, just like the Romans would in the Roman Empire. Once they're gone, however, then these problems crop up. Now, it's important to note that the imperial powers don't solve these problems, they simply keep them quiet, and when the imperial power is gone, then they erupt. So this is what we're going to see. This is the pattern that we're looking for over and over again in chapter 37. All right, so let's get started. New patterns of imperialism. Okay, so European imperial empires collapsed after World War II. Here's the statistic. Over 90 nations gained independence after World War II, which shows how, even after World War I, as devastated as Europe was, most of Europe kept control of their empire. After World War II, that would completely collapse. Okay? Imperial eras of nationalist movements. Here are the areas we're going to cover. We'll start with Africa, which is going to have a lot of different branches of that tree. Then we'll go to India, which is mainly just one conflict that we'll study. Southeast Asia, which will include Vietnam. And then the Arab states. And there's another one after this that I added, which includes Eastern Europe, and that is after the fall of communism. We'll talk about the Bosnian crisis. Okay? Let's get started with Africa. Okay, so here's Africa, and here's a map of the imperial powers. Green is the British, okay, and the British are going to control the most profitable areas, the Suez Canal in the north, the diamond mines in the south, the areas of the Gold Coast in the east. France is going to control a lot of area, but you have to remember a lot of that area is desert, and so they got rock and sand. Yay! All right, if you ever watch those old films where you got the Foreign Legion marching across the desert from one lonely fort to another lonely fort, well, that's what they got, right? And they fought wars with the Bedouin tribes of that area for decades and decades because of rocks and sand. The Belgians were there, of course. Don't forget the Belgian Congo. The Portuguese, just to the south of that, remember they were the first ones to get into the game. The Italians have a couple of areas. Ethiopia, that's kind of generous of the map to say that they conquered Ethiopia. 1936, remember, that was Mussolini, not the first attempt. And then the Spanish, just very barely in the north there, near Morocco, was the Spanish. Okay? All right. So that's where we were. Where are we going? Africa. Okay, so the smaller countries first. A lot of countries negotiated the peace with the imperial power as they left. And so there was a transition that wasn't so violent. Senegal was and I'm going to do my best with these names. The new African president is Blaise Diagne, agitated for African participation in politics and fair treatment by the French army. South Africa was a big one. South Africa is going to be part, and again, like most British protectorates during this period of time, say for India and Hong Kong, these areas had, in America, I guess, the United States, these areas had become part of the Commonwealth. Okay, and the Commonwealth meant that they shared an independent government, but was still loyal to the British Crown. Canada being a great example, Australia and New Zealand being another example. So South Africa had become part of that Commonwealth. So South Africa had a white governing body, but the majority of people, of course, were Africans, and they were governed by the British connected government, right? So 1909, 1912, there are a couple of dates I saw there, but in the early 20th century, the Africans of South Africa create the ANC, or the African National Congress, to defend the interests of Africans. As time went on, the white ruling class of South Africa would pass what we call apartheid. And in my class, I call it segregation on steroids, which is a division, a distinct division between where Africans can go and where whites could go in South Africa. And the nicer hotels, the nicer clubs, all these places would be whites only, and Africans only would have everything else, right? And so this division, of course, would lead to conflict. The laws weren't the same, and Africans were persecuted. There were movements to try to overthrow this persecution, some of the violent movements. One of those movements would include Nelson Mandela, who would be thrown in prison and spend many years in prison. But this idea of apartheid would finally end in 1994 when Nelson Mandela, released from prison, is elected the first African president of South Africa. Again, we're doing our movie reviews, and I think of movies all the time. I really have to update this list. I think it's from like the early 2000s. One great movie that you can watch for your movie review, if you want to do that, is called Invictus. You might have heard of it. It's got Matt Damon in it. It's got Morgan Freeman in it. It can't be a bad movie with Morgan Freeman, right? But it's about this idea of the ending of apartheid. Okay? And so that is the story of South Africa today. Of course, it is majority ruled by Africans. There's Nelson Mandela, right, is considered to be, by most sane people, one of the great leaders of our time, right? Okay, so Africa continued at Ethiopia. Don't forget about Haile Selassie. We talked about Haile Selassie being the leader that pushed the Italians out in the imperial period. Mussolini got him back in 1936 when the Italians conquered Ethiopia. But after World War II, Haile Selassie would storm back, the Lion of Ethiopia would storm back, overthrow the Italians, and create his own government in Ethiopia. He was a tough guy, right? And so that is the story of Ethiopia. Algeria would be a little more muddled. Algeria was a French colony, and this is in North Africa in the Sahara, right? You have two forces there that the conservative government, led by Charles de Gaulle in France, wants to keep a hold of Algeria for prestige purposes, right? In 1954, war breaks out between the National Liberation Front and the pro-French forces. There's atrocities on both sides, and it's pretty terrible. Eventually, in 1962, Algeria is granted its independence from France, but then you have a large migration of pro-French Africans moving to southern Africa to get away from the retribution of the FLN, right? And so you have violence in Algeria going on for a number of decades. You have conservative Muslims there that hold a grudge against the French and what the French had done. And then a lot of the violence we see today in France, Muslim violence, comes from South Africa and goes back not to just a religious difference, but also goes back to the imperial period. Okay? All right, so here we have a photo of 1962 in Algeria and how the Algerians gained their independence and the French moved out. Yes? Very good. Moving right along, we have the Pan-African movement. Which is, again, an African movement to bring countries together in order to create nationalist states. Kwame Nkrumah was the leader of that movement, eventually become the Prime Minister of Ghana. Jomo Kenyatta, also a leader in that movement, would become the leader, the head of state of Kenya. And then you have the issue with Africa. And as we've learned, Africa was completely conquered, except for Ethiopia and Liberia, by European powers in the imperial period. And each of those places was carved up and given as districts or zones to be controlled by the European power. No care was taken to divide the boundaries to like separate tribes that didn't like each other. They were just done like European interests. And so what you have in these countries is you have tribes living together that have a history, and they don't like each other very much, and then they have to live under the imperial power. One tribe maybe be more helpful than the other, and so when the imperial power leaves, there's still bad feelings in this country that was made by the Europeans, by these two tribes, and that's going to lead to a lot of violence. Rwanda is the most tragic example of this. In 1994, you have two tribes in Rwanda. You have Tutsis and you have Hutus, okay? And Tutsis and Hutus don't like each other very much. But over the period of time, Tutsis and Hutus are married and they kind of intermingle, but they're still two distinct groups. Once the French leave, then 1994, a few decades later, the Tutsi rebels start to rebel against the government and start to kill Hutus. And by killing, I mean shooting, but not just shooting, machetes and hatchets and just massacres, dragging people out of their homes. And the government can't get a hold of the situation. Again, another movie that you might look into is Hotel Rwanda. Hotel Rwanda is about a true story of a hotel in the middle of this that protected Hutus against Tutsis and almost got destroyed in itself. And the genocide is a terrible massacre that occurs, but it's an example of a symptom of imperialism, that imperialism had left. So many African countries give way to tribal tensions and local warlords, and that's what happens a lot in Africa. We have some of the worst dictators in modern history, Idi Amin and other dictators that take over weakened countries and use the military to exploit their power, and sometimes are guilty of mass murders of civilians in these areas, right? Okay, here is an example of the violence in Rwanda and against Tutsis and Hutus. Eventually, the Hutu government would take back over the country, but of course, thousands lose their lives, maybe millions lose their lives. Millions more are displaced and refugees and things like that in this terrible tragedy in '94. India. Okay, so that's Africa. Very quickly, overview. Let's get to India. We're familiar with India. The British are there. We've talked about Gandhi already. We kind of left off with Gandhi at his height. The Salt March we talked about and all the other satyagraha moments, peaceful protests, yes. So India in 1947 will gain its independence. And this is an interesting subplot or side plot in British history as well, because after the war, Churchill is the hero, right? And Churchill, you would think, if he were an American president, they would elect him for as many terms as he wanted to be elected. But the election after World War II sees Churchill's party voted out of power. And as an American, you're like, well, how could they do that? That's so ungrateful. You got the guy who saved your country from the Nazis, and then you vote him out. But the issue is this. Churchill was a conservative and an imperialist. And the majority of people in Britain felt that it was time to give that up and fix themselves. Britain was in a very bad state. They had been devastated by Nazi bombs. Their economy was really bad off. And so they didn't have the money or the wherewithal to take care of India and all these other places that they had once ruled. Churchill, of course, like de Gaulle, wanted to keep these places because it meant prestige, the look of power. India, of course, was in ever since Churchill had been alive, and in generations before they had controlled India, and so he was unwilling to give that up. So they said, "See you later, Mr. Churchill," and they voted in Adlai Stevenson and the head of the other party, right? And so shortly after that, India is granted its independence in '47. Now, the British had come to the Indians and said, "Look, if we leave, you're going to have problems." So those problems existed between Hindus and Muslims in India. And we've also talked about this. The idea that the Indian National Congress was created by Hindus, but then the Muslims created the Muslim League in order to protect their rights. And so there's already bad feelings that we see in India between Hindus and Muslims. And the British were right. After they leave, violence erupts between Hindus and Muslims. And not even Gandhi can stop this, yes? And so eventually the British come in. The leaders here, we have Gandhi, who wants to keep the country united. But then we have the Hindu leader, which is Nehru. We've talked about Nehru, who wants to create a modern Indian state, industrialize it, and make it to compete in the modern world. Then we also have the Muslim leader, who is called Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And Jinnah is going to fight for Islamic rights, yes, and in the minority, they are very sensitive about that, and so he and Nehru clash on a number of occasions over what these laws and what the Constitution should look like, and that clash spills off into violence between Muslims and Hindus. Eventually, the British negotiate a peace between the two, and that peace deals with what we call partition. Now, what happens is the British say, okay, well, let's reach a compromise. You obviously are not going to be able to live together. So we'll give the Muslims the northwest west corner of India, right? And we're going to separate India into two different countries. We'll have India in the south for Hindus and India in the north for Muslims, and that area will be called, you guessed it, Pakistan, right? And so now Hindus in the north have to move south to India, and Muslims in the south have to move north to Pakistan. Now, this is going to cause violence because it's very inconvenient, especially for the poor, right? They might not have the money to do this, but they're forced to move anyway. And in fact, during this time, Gandhi is actually assassinated by a Hindu, a conservative Hindu, who doesn't want to leave his home in the north. And so Gandhi is shot and killed. Killed Gandhi, jeez. And so eventually this becomes the compromise, right? Muslims, then I showed you the book, Train to Pakistan, that I read when I was in college. It's a fictional book, but it's about this idea of Muslims and Muslims and Hindus moving north and south during this period of time, right? Okay, so this is what we just talked about. The British negotiate partition of India into two states. Pakistan in the north would be Muslim. India in the south would be Hindu. And violence occurs with deadly attacks on both sides, right? And so it is a very tense situation in India. And even to this day, Pakistan and India don't really like each other very much. There's a lot of tension between the two countries. All right, so here we have Jinnah on the left, Gandhi, as you're familiar with, in the middle, and then we have Nehru on the right. If you Google Nehru, you see that vest. He wore that vest a lot. It's called the Nehru jacket. You can get one of those. It's very stylish, right? The Nehru jacket's what it's called. Maybe start selling those. Side business. All right, so now let's move to, that's the story of India, Pakistan and India, right? Now we go to nationalism in Southeast Asia. Indonesia. Sukarno is the nationalist leader, and Sukarno actually supported the Japanese during World War II, but he supported the Japanese in order to try to get the Dutch out. The Dutch used Indonesia as a colony, and hopefully the Japanese would help him create an independence, right? But after the war, Sukarno actually negotiated with the Allies and was able to make peace with them, and he becomes the dictator of Indonesia until he is removed by military coup in 1965, right? And so there's a nationalist but dictator in Indonesia until the military coup in 1965. Burma is granted independence by the British in 1948, so shortly after India, Burma, another holding of the British Empire. And then the U.S. and the Philippines, right? The U.S. was in the Philippines in World War II. MacArthur was stationed there, reconquers the Philippines. And after the war, the Filipinos who had fought bravely with the Americans are rewarded in 1946 by granted independence. And they still are an independent country today. Okay, so Vietnam. Indochina, as it was called by the imperial powers, right? And so this is the east coast of the peninsula of Southeast Asia that Americans in the late 20th century would become very familiar with. The leader of Vietnam was a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh's backstory is kind of similar to Gandhi's. He had gone to Europe, he had studied in Europe, he had come back to his home to try to create a nationalist state. But he's a communist, which is different from Gandhi, right? And so he believes in socialism. He'd read Marx in Paris where he went to college, and he believed in communism. Now, remember the Cold War video that I put up, where this was after Korea, and Eisenhower had implemented the domino policy. And the domino policy was that we had to protect countries in Asia, because if one country became communist, then they'd all fall like a bunch of dominoes in a line, yes? And so Vietnam is going to be where this policy is actually implemented in the 60s and 70s by the U.S., okay? So the communist government took over the north, and the non-communist nationalist government took over the south. And so now, like Korea, we have a communist north and a non-communist south. And I hesitate to call it a democratic south because the leader was a dictator and it wasn't very popular either. But as we learned from U.S. history, the U.S. was willing to prop up any leader that was anti-communist during this period of time. And so we supported Diem Bien, I think was his name, in the south, against the communist North, Ho Chi Minh. Now, war erupts between North and South. The French were there at first, of course, and the French tried to hold on to Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh would kick the French out, and then the two sides were separated. But then the North begins to push the South, right? And the U.S. says, well, we can't let this happen. It's the domino effect. And so the U.S. first sends military advisors to the South to train their soldiers in order to fight the North. and eventually the U.S. will become heavily involved. Now, we're not going to get into the whole U.S. side of this because you have U.S. history next year, and you can get that there. We're just mainly going to give you the basics of it. But what we need to understand from our point of view is that there was a complete misunderstanding about this war from the U.S. side to the Vietnamese side, right? And when you look at the stats, and you have to understand why each side was fighting in order to understand what happened, because the U.S. would lose a lot of soldiers in Vietnam, but not nearly as many soldiers as were lost by the Vietnamese, right? Civilians and soldiers. And so the question is, what were they fighting for? And the answer to that is the Americans were fighting for the domino theory, to try to keep communism locked up in the north and not let it spread south and eventually to the rest of Southeast Asia, which was their fear. But Ho Chi Minh set up this war for the Vietnamese as a war of revolution. So it is their American Revolution. They believed the Americans were an imperialist power, just like the French. They were going to come in and conquer their country and use all their materials and subjugate them as second-class citizens. And that's why the Vietnamese were willing to die in such great numbers, because they were fighting for their freedom, right? Whereas America was just fighting to contain communism. And after the body count grows and grows, the American public is not into this war. They don't want this war anyway, as we see from the protests of the late 60s and early 70s. And so America is not willing to let so many Americans die in order to keep this area on the other side of the world. And so America pulls out of this war and signs the negotiated peace, right? But here's the thing. The domino theory was predicated on the idea that no one in their right mind would ever want to be communist, right? That you would have to be forced to be communist, that it's so unpopular that no one would want to do this. And what we found in Vietnam is that, the whole point of Korea was let's hold free elections. If you hold free elections, then people will want to be democratic. And that probably was true in Korea. But in Vietnam, if you were to hold free elections, the majority of the population would have voted to be communist, right? And that scared America. We can't let free elections happen because then the Vietnamese will just choose communism and they'll be a communist country. So we fight this war in order to contain the North without free elections, and they win anyway. And now Vietnam is communist, right? This is to talk about synthesis, this is the idea that America sometimes has, is all you need to do is let the people speak, and freedom and goodness and all this stuff will happen. This was George W. Bush's policy in Iraq. Just let the Iraqis vote. Just let anybody vote, and they'll choose the right government. Well, during his presidency, Palestine had a vote, and they elected the leader of Hamas as president. And so that was not what America wanted, but that's what the people chose. And so just because you have a democracy, just because you have a vote, doesn't mean it's going to turn out like you think it's supposed to, right? And this was the case in Vietnam. So finally, and again, Paris peace talks and stuff like that, that's more of a U.S. history thing. Finally, the war ends under Nixon, and in 1975, Vietnam is reunified under a communist government. Okay, so Vietnam is communist. Okay, here we have Ho Chi Minh. Yes. And over here we have the map of North and South Vietnam. And today, of course, it's all united as one Vietnamese country. Okay, moving on. Arab states. Okay, now, so the Arab states are going to center around two conflicts. The first conflict is going to be Jews moving into Palestine, right? The second conflict is going to be the imperial powers that have controlled that area for so many years. And so the second conflict is similar to India or other places in Africa or Southeast Asia. It's getting the Westerners out. But the first one, the Jews moving back to Palestine, is going to be unique to this area and is going to give a whole different and nasty scene to this conflict, right? And so, first of all, let's do some review. We've talked about the Balfour Declaration and the Zionist movement. In the 19th century, Theodore Herzl wanted to start a movement where you take the Jews back to Palestine, right? Because they weren't wanted in Europe anyway. Kind of foreshadowing of let's get out of Dodge while the getting is good. The British Parliament, who controlled Palestine at the time, was able to pass the Balfour Declaration, which says we will help Jews who wanted to go back and settle in Palestine, and we will help them settle and protect them there. There was a lot of conflict during that period of time, but then the World Wars broke out, and that conflict was kind of pushed to the side. After World War II, after the Holocaust, right, many Jews in Europe are homeless. They've got nowhere to go back to. So the United Nations says, let's send them to Palestine. That is their traditional homeland. Many of them wanted to go back there anyway, and so we have this huge migration of Jews from Europe to Palestine after World War II, and we settle them in territories in what is today the nation of Israel. Now, the problem, of course, is it's not just an empty space that they move into. There are Muslims living there, and they've lived there for generations. And so now the Muslims who are not asked about this are forced to push like their stuff to the side and make room for the Jews who come in, right? Now, on May 4th, again, not really getting into the details of this, but there was a conflict in 48, and in that conflict, the Jewish settlers established the nation of Israel. So there's no Israel in the Zionist movement. There's just Jews living in Palestine. Remember, Palestine is the Roman name. It's Latin for that area. And so they were just living there, but eventually in 48, they would rise up and fight and carve out the nation of Israel as we know it today. So the nation of Israel was formed in 48, so it's really not that old. And we have the flag with the Star of David, and Jerusalem becomes the capital, just like in the Bible. And this is what the Jews living there feel, that this is God's will, right? God gave them this land. It is the Holy Land. And so because of the Jewish uprising and the creation of Israel, as well as the Western support of Israel and the Western imperialism, the history of that in the area, many Muslim countries got together and created the movement known as Pan-Arabism. It was led by the president of Egypt named Gamal Abdel Nasser. But instead of being just a sorority of a club of Muslim nations that surrounded the Jewish Israel, Nasser tried to use it to his own gains and make Egypt stronger, and that's going to make the alliance kind of fall apart. But it's going to be the Pan-Arab movement that's going to fight these wars with Israel over the next few decades. Here we have a picture of the Israeli flag. This is a more modern picture, right? But the Jews still living in that area still have a lot of national pride, on their country and in the area, the Holy Land that was given to them by God. Okay, so Arab nationalism continues. First of all, in 56, we have the Suez Crisis. Suez, of course, is the canal that connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. In the imperial period, the British had taken it over, and it became like a British cash cow that they just charged ships. The Egyptians, under Nasser, tried to nationalize it, and so that all ships having to go through the Suez Canal would have to pay the Egyptian government money. The Israelis invade Egypt because of that, and the Israelis are supported by Britain and France, who also used the canal frequently and didn't want to have to, be subservient to the Egyptians. The Soviets threatened to join the Egyptians against Britain and France. And if you remember the idea of NATO, Britain and France are heavily connected to the United States. So the United States steps in and says, nobody's going to fight anybody. He breaks everything up and brings things back the way it was. And so the crisis is averted because the U.S. steps in and negotiates the peace. And the Suez Canal remains open, right, and not controlled, not nationalized by the Egyptian government. Other Arab-Israeli conflicts, the first one happens in 67, so about a decade later. You have the Six-Day War. In the Six-Day War, you have Egypt and Syria and Jordan all surprise attack Israel and try to push the Israelis back. The Israelis will counterattack, and it actually flips the war, and the Syria and Egypt and Jordan are split, and eventually they are defeated. And at the end of this war, Israel expands its territory from the original and expands it into other Muslim territories. The next war happens in 73, a few years later. This is the Yom Kippur War. Again, a number of Arab countries attack Israel on the holiday of Yom Kippur, trying to catch them off guard. They have initial success where they push the Israelis back in the Golan Heights and other areas, but then the Israelis counterattack and push the Arab countries back. And by the end of the war, when the negotiation occurs, Israel is like much bigger than it was before. And this is when they take over those Muslim areas and use those Muslim areas as part of Israel as a buffer zone against the other Arab countries. And so here we are. This is a paper, I think, from the Six-Day War. And so the war ends, total Israeli victory. And that's what we really see in these two wars is that whatever objective the Arab countries had is completely lost. And what happens is Israel actually gains territory, So we have OPEC. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It includes originally Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Those were the top 5 countries. And one thing you notice that all these countries have in common is they were originally, when oil was discovered, all these countries were taken advantage of by Western powers in the price of oil. The British would come in to many of these areas. Even America would come into Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and buy the oil cheap and then sell it for a profit. So OPEC comes together as kind of a protection against that, protection against the West coming in and stealing the oil for a lower price. But again, this would really, these people have a lot of power since so many people drive cars and use gasoline. They regulate the price of oil, and that's going to be significant to the world economies. So their purpose is to coordinate unified petroleum policies among member countries in order to secure a fair and stable price for petroleum producers and efficient economic regulatory supply of petroleum. It's also used as a political chip as well. If something's going on in the world that the members of OPEC don't like, they can jack up the price of gasoline in order to get other countries to do what they want. And gasoline's a very important commodity even today, right? All right, so here's the symbol of OPEC today. Interesting symbol. I didn't look that up, so look it up, figure out what it means. All right, so the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Okay, after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur Wars, the new area is home. The new area that the Israelis conquer has a lot of Muslims living in it now, and it's called the occupied territory. It is part of Israel, but these Muslims live in it. These Muslims have no country anymore. They are homeless, living in the Jewish nation of Israel, right? These Muslims will become known as Palestinians. So here we have our modern definition, right? Remember, Palestinian is originally the Latin word, but now Palestinian means someone who is a Muslim living in Israel, right? On the west side of Israel. And these Muslims clash with Israelis over territory and religious sites. Hebron is one example of this. Hebron has the tomb of Abraham, and the tomb of Abraham, the building is actually separated, so Muslims can go to one side, Jews can go to the other side. And the reason they separated is because there's been so much violence there over the years between Muslims and Jews, right? So Muslims formed the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. A man named Yasser Arafat is going to be the head of the PLO from 1960 to like the 2000s. He was very much a part of what I remember when I first got into world politics and seeing Yasser Arafat. It's like, oh yeah, I know that guy. And so he's going to be very important, right? But after his death, he is the head of the PLO until his death in 2004, from like 1969 to 2004. But when he dies, then Palestinians move more toward the radical side of Islam that we understand it today, and the group they form in Palestine is called Hamas. And Hamas is going to be on the terrorist list of all Western countries. They're going to be guilty of bombing places in Israel as well as bombing other places in Europe. This is when Israel builds all those walls and checkpoints that they close themselves off if there's ever an attack, and Muslims are restricted from going here and there. And so this is why Israel is so closed off and shut down in so many times, because of Hamas and the bombings of Hamas, right? Recently, just this week, the leader of Hamas was elected as president of Palestine. And so still very popular among the people. The former leader of Hamas, I should say. There's Yasser Arafat. That's his cool days. I love the glasses and the headgear. That's the Yasser Arafat I remember, right? He actually had a wife who was French, and she was really pretty. I don't know how that happened, but anyway. Okay. Afghanistan. Okay, this is something that we're probably familiar with, right? The USSR invades Afghanistan in 1979. What happened was Afghanistan had a leader, and that leader was pro-communist, right? But then, it's a Muslim country, and so your Muslim leaders in that country try to rise up and overthrow the communist leader. They are able to kick him out of power, but in order to replace him or put him back into power, the Soviets invade in 79. And in American history, this is the Carter administration, and Carter, it kills the SALT treaty talks, and Carter's also going to cancel the Olympic Games, which is a PR nightmare. He never should have done that. But because they were held in Moscow that year, right? So rebel forces supplied with arms from the United States. This was a CIA operation. Again, another movie, Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts, is a great story of how Charlie Wilson, a senator from Texas, got funding to supply these mujahideen, the Afghani freedom fighters, with Stinger missiles and things to shoot down Russian helicopters. They spent billions of dollars supplying the mujahideen. They didn't get directly involved, But what Afghanistan becomes is Russia's Vietnam, right? They're there for years. They don't get anything done. They lose a lot of soldiers, and it cripples their economy as well as their morale, the national morale, and eventually the Russians lose because the CIA is moving weapons to the Mujahideen, right? So 1992, President Najibullah is ousted from office, and the brutal war begins between Islamic militias. And so the Russians are gone by 92, but the president, Najibullah, tries to keep the country together. And you'll learn from, if you watch Charlie Wilson's War, America, after the war's over, America pulls its money out. There's no money for infrastructure, building schools and towns and replacing things the Russians had destroyed. And so Afghanistan remains an impoverished country. And in that impoverished country, you have different Muslim groups that are fighting each other. The Taliban is a Muslim group in Afghanistan from the south. And they are eventually going to, with the support of Pakistan and with the support of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization, they're going to rise up and take over the country of Afghanistan, right? And that happens in around 2000, right? They control all of it. Then, of course, as we know, in 2001, 9/11 happens. The Twin Towers are destroyed by Al-Qaeda. Military intelligence points to the direction of Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda fighters are trained. The U.S. invades Afghanistan and overthrows the Taliban in late 2001. And again, that conflict is still going on. The Taliban is still very much alive and well in Afghanistan. We have put a president in place there to try to support that. We're trying to trade the Afghans to hold off the Taliban on their own, but it's a very long and arduous process, and it's hard for us to get out of that country. We've been there a long time, right? Okay, so that's Afghanistan. Okay, here's some Afghani fighters. This is Taliban, right? And another thing about the Taliban, we talked about opium a little earlier. One of the main cash crops in Afghanistan is poppies. And so one of the ways the Taliban bankrolled their war is to sell opium, sell drugs. And so when you buy drugs, yes, you probably are supporting, in an indirect way, terrorism. Don't do drugs. Okay. Nationalism in Eastern Europe. This is the last thing, and then we're done, okay? Now, with imperialism here, we're not talking about 1800s and countries that conquer areas in order to build railroads and steal raw materials. We're talking about communism. The Soviet Union controlled the eastern countries of Europe, as we learned, the Eastern Bloc countries. And one country that was allied with the Soviet Union was Yugoslavia, right? And so Yugoslavia was kind of dominated by the Soviet Union for a long period of time. When communism collapses in the late 80s, then Yugoslavia is freed, whoopee, but there are a lot of different ethnicities in Yugoslavia that don't like each other, and so just like India, we're going to have conflict, okay? So the war in Bosnia is what we call this. After the fall of the Soviet Union, ethnic and racial violence in the former Soviet Union bloc countries in the Balkans, right? The Balkans is that area on the other side of Italy. You have Italy, and to the west you have the Balkans next to Greece, okay? After the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which is the communist government of Yugoslavia, dissolves in 1991, violence erupts between Bosnian Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats. Now here, give you just a brief background of this country. This area has been fought over by Ottoman Turks and Catholic Christians and Orthodox people, and eventually, when the fighting stops, they just all settle and live there. So we have descendants of the Turks there, we have descendants of Roman Catholics there, we have descendants of Greek Orthodox there, and they're just all living in the same area. Now we talk about nationalism. There are places where you have a majority of Muslims who want to create a Muslim state in Eastern Europe, and you have other places in Yugoslavia who want to create another ethnic state. It's just nationalism. But the government of Yugoslavia wants to keep everyone together, and they're willing to use force to do that, right? So the states of Bosnia and Herzegovina voted for independence, but this referendum was rejected by the Serbs, or the majority, right? This is where the trouble begins. Bosnian Serbs under the government of Slobodan Milosevic and the Yugoslav People's Army, which is the JNA. It's a different language. Relax, right? They attack the Bosnians and the Herzegovinians territories. They commit atrocities. We're talking civilian deaths, rapes. They imprison Albanians as well as Bosnians in concentration camps. And yes, I mean concentration camps, just like the Nazis. Okay? Eventually, the other side, the Muslims, are going to receive backing from Pakistan, and they will create paramilitary organizations of guerrilla fighters known as and they push the JNA back. And so there's atrocities on both sides. The majority of atrocities are committed by the Serbs, though. In 1995, finally, NATO, America too, the UN peacekeeping forces move into the former Republic of Yugoslavia to protect civilian populations, and peace talks began. And so this war it lasts for a few years. In 1995, finally, there's so many deaths and so many terrible images coming out of Bosnia of mass graves and people starving in camps, seeing their ribs and things like that, just like World War II, that the U.S. and the rest of European powers says we have to do something about this. So the army moves in, and this is the military arm of the UN. Remember, the UN has teeth in the 20th century, not like the League of Nations in the early 20th century. They move in with their military force, and they force people to stop fighting, and they start to talk peace. Okay? So here we have Yugoslavia. The whole colored area there is Yugoslavia. But there are the 6 republics: Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia. The big pink area there is going to be the majority, and the former Yugoslavia Republic. This republic wants to go independent and is invaded by the big pink area. Croatia also gets involved in this, and all the fighting and atrocities happen right here. Right? That's what we're talking about. Marshal Tito was the communist leader of Yugoslavia, and he remained independent from the Soviet Union, even though he was allied with the Soviet Union. And he was a pretty tough cookie on his own, right? But a communist dictator. After him, we have Slobodan Milosevic. He's the one in charge of sending Serbian troops into Bosnia and creating the atrocities there. Srebrenica is an example of an event where the Serbian army moves into the city and just shoots everyone in the city, rapes, kills, and then buries them in this mass grave. And so this is one of the more terrible events of the war in Bosnia. This is a photo of British peacekeeping force in Bosnia. The tanks roll in, separate the people out. A lot of people have been uprooted from their homes. They're allowed to go back, but you have this weird thing where, like, Serbs had moved into their homes and had been living there for a year, and now the Serbs had to move out and give the homes back to the Bosnians. You know, that happened quite a bit. The Kosovo Liberation Army, this is the army that fought the JNA, and so you equip them real fast and give them uniforms and say, go fight. And so you have this war in the mountains of Bosnia between the JNA and the KLA. And then you have the terrible photos. It's a little blurry there or grainy, but the terrible photos of the concentration camps. Again, eerily similar to Nazi camps in World War II. People were just starved, just not fed, and many of them died of starvation in these camps. And then you have satire. This is one of the cartoons. In the satire here, you have a NATO tank moving into Kosovo, and you have deaths, hitching a ride on the tank. And the criticism of this cartoon is that NATO acted too slowly, right? It didn't get into the war early enough to save enough people, and when it did get into the war, it moved like a snail's pace to try to get to people and save them. And so this is the criticism of this cartoon. Finally, you have the Dayton peace talks. Yeah, Dayton, Ohio is where they had these peace talks, right? Peace talks between the warring sides were sponsored by the U.S. and conducted in Dayton. And then the Dayton Peace Accords, November 21st, 1995. The Bosnians and Albanians were restored to their former lands. Serbian forces were responsible for war crimes. Milosevic was considered a war criminal. He had to be captured by the UN, but he was sent on trial to The Hague, which is where all the international trials take place. But he dies of a heart attack before he could ever come to trial. So he never gets justice as far as he gets death, but he doesn't get justice as far as the Bosnians are concerned, right? But he and the Serbs were accused of creating all the atrocities of the concentration camps and the killing of civilians in the mass graves. And so here we have another satirical cartoon, The Death of Milosevic. If you're an art fan, this is a copy of a Rembrandt painting, but it says, so it was suicide, murder, or heart disease. Well, he doesn't appear to have had a heart. Any sign of malady was in there, and so other leaders that were on trial, and many of these leaders went into hiding, had to be found and captured, right? And Milosevic actually held up in his presidential palace and was surrounded by the army and eventually surrendered, yes? But he did die of a heart attack before his trial, and these are people looking for his heart, and they can't find it, of course, because he is a tyrant. All right, so there you go. Nationalist movements, 44 minutes, not so bad, right? And so the idea here, of course, is that, as we said in the beginning, nationalist movements in the late 20th century are going to create nations, but these nations aren't always going to be peaceful. And the issues continue to this day. Bad feelings, between not only toward the Western powers, but bad feelings toward different groups inside the country itself causes the conflicts that we have today. And so look at the bigger picture here, especially for the AP exam, and know how these events connect to the larger narrative of history. Okay? Those are my wise words. Now I'll see you soon. You guys study hard.